Captain Jake Morrison stepped off his ship and onto the metal floors of Nexus Prime Trading Station. The air smelled like fuel and 1,000 different alien foods mixed together. His boots made soft clicking sounds as he walked through the busy corridors. Creatures from dozens of worlds moved around him, buying and selling goods from across the galaxy. Jake was a human, one of the newer species to join the galactic community. His ship, the Horizon's Edge, needed supplies and repairs. After a long journey through the Outer Rim, he was 35 years old with brown hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of the universe's darker corners. As he walked toward the main market area, Jake noticed something strange. The corridor ahead was almost empty, even though it was the main path to the shopping district. A few alien traders were pressed against the walls, their eyes fixed on something Jake couldn't see yet. Their faces showed the same emotion, fear. Then he saw the reason. A massive figure stood at the center of the corridor, 12 feet tall and covered in black armor that looked like it had been carved from volcanic rock. The creature's skin was dark as space itself, and amber eyes glowed behind a helmet that left most of his face visible. Each of his arms was thick as a tree trunk, and Jake could see weapons attached to his belt that could probably destroy a small building. This was Kethver, though Jake didn't know his name yet. The human had heard stories about the Vorthok warriors from other traders, but seeing one in person was different. The story said they had once ruled half the galaxy through fear and violence. They said the Vorthok could destroy entire planets with their bare hands and sing songs that could drive enemies mad with terror. Jake watched as a group of short, furry traders called Quillan approached the intersection. When they saw Kethver, they immediately turned around and took a longer route. A tall, thin alien with blue skin did the same thing. Even the floating jellyfish-like creatures that usually feared nothing seemed to avoid the area where the warrior stood, but Jake noticed something the others missed. When Kethver thought no one was looking, his shoulders dropped slightly. His head turned toward the fleeing aliens, and there was something in his glowing eyes that wasn't anger or threat. It looked almost like sadness. The warrior was alone. Completely alone in a corridor full of people who were too afraid to get within. 50 feet of him. Jake made a decision that would change everything. Instead of turning around like everyone else, he walked forward. His heart was beating fast, but he kept moving. As he got closer, he could see that Kethver's armor was old but well-maintained. There were marks on it that looked like they came from battles fought long ago. When Jake was about 20 feet away, Kethver's head turned toward him. Those amber eyes locked onto the human's face, and Jake felt like he was being examined by a predator. The warrior's hand moved slightly toward the weapon at his side. Jake raised his hands to show he wasn't carrying anything dangerous. "Excuse me," he said in the common galactic language. "I'm looking for the supply depot. Could you point me in the right direction?" Kethver stared at him for a long moment. The warrior's eyes narrowed as if he couldn't believe someone was actually talking to him. Finally, he raised one massive arm and pointed down a side corridor. He didn't say anything. "Thank you," Jake said, and he meant it. He walked in the direction Kethver had pointed, feeling those amber eyes watching him until he turned the corner. Later that day, Jake found himself in a small restaurant that served food from different worlds. The owner was a nervous Quillan named Veltar, who kept wiping his hands on his apron. When Jake asked about the warrior he'd seen, Veltar's fur stood up like he'd been shocked. "You spoke to him?" Veltar asked, his voice high with surprise. "The Vorthok warrior? Are you insane?" "He seemed harmless enough," Jake said, taking a bite of something that tasted like spiced meat. "Just pointed me toward the supply depot." Veltar sat down across from Jake, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "His name is Kethver. He came here 50 years ago and offered to work as a peacekeeper. We said yes because, well, who would say no to a Vorthok warrior? But he's different from what the stories say." "Different how?" "He never starts fights. He stops them. When traders get into arguments, he just has to show up and everyone calms down. When pirates try to attack ships near the station, he goes out in his fighter and they run away. But he never talks to anyone, never removes his armor." Lives in the abandoned section of the station where no one else goes. Jake finished his meal while thinking about what Veltar had said. After paying, he walked back toward his ship. The corridors were quieter now as the station's artificial day cycle was ending. As he passed through the same intersection where he'd met Kethver, he saw the warrior again. This time, Kethver was standing near a large window that looked out into space. He was watching the stars and his posture was different. Without anyone around to see him, he looked tired. Very tired. Jake approached slowly, making sure his footsteps could be heard. Kethver turned when he got close, but this time his hand didn't move toward his weapon. Beautiful view, Jake said, standing next to the window. Space stretched out before them, filled with stars and the lights of passing ships. Kethver looked at him with those glowing eyes. "Why are you not afraid?" he asked. His voice was deep and rough, like rocks grinding together. It sounded like he didn't use it very often. Jake thought about the question. "I guess because fear doesn't help much. I've been afraid of a lot of things in my life, but running away never made anything better." "Your species is young," Kethver said after a long pause. "You do not know what the Vorthek have done. I know some of the stories, but stories are about the past. I'm more interested in what's happening now." Kethver was quiet for a long time, staring out at the stars. Finally, he spoke again. "I patrol this station every day. I have done so for 50 years. In all that time, you are the first being to speak to me without fear or anger." "Maybe they're missing out," Jake said. The warrior looked at him with what might have been surprise. "You think others are missing out on speaking?" "To me, I think everyone's missing out on speaking to each other. Fear makes us all alone." Kethver turned back to the window. "Alone is safer. Safer, maybe, but not better." They stood in silence for a while, two very different beings looking out at the same stars. Jake could feel the loneliness coming off. The warrior like heat from a fire. It was a feeling he recognized from his own life. "I should go," Jake said finally. "My ship needs work, and my crew is probably wondering where I am." As he started to walk away, Kethver spoke again. "The supply depot closes at the end of the work cycle. The parts you need will be available tomorrow." Jake stopped and turned back. "Thank you, I'll remember that. My name is Kethver." "Jake Morrison. It was good to meet you, Kethver." The warrior nodded slightly, the first time Jake had seen him make any gesture that wasn't threatening or directing. As Jake walked away, he felt like something important had just happened. Though he couldn't say exactly what. Behind him, Kethver remained at the window, watching the stars. But now, for the first time in 50 years, he wasn't completely alone. Someone had spoken his name without fear, and that small thing felt like a crack in the wall he had built around himself. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers, but sometimes the smallest actions could change everything. Jake Morrison didn't know it yet, but his simple act of kindness had just planted a seed that would grow into something much larger than either of them could imagine. Jake Morrison spent the next 3 days getting his ship repaired and resupplied. Every morning, he would walk through the station's corridors and look for Kethver. The warrior seemed to follow the same route each day, checking different areas of the station at regular times. Jake began to notice the pattern. At first, Jake would just nod when he saw the warrior. Kethver would nod back, a tiny movement of his massive head. It wasn't much, but it was more than anyone else got from him. The other aliens still crossed to the other side of corridors when they saw Kethver coming. Some even took completely different routes to avoid him. On the 4th day, Jake decided to do something different. When he found Kethver standing near the docking bay, watching ships come and go, Jake sat down on a nearby cargo container. The warrior looked at him with those glowing amber eyes but didn't move away. "Busy day," Jake said, gesturing at the ships. "A lot of traffic coming through." Kethver didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. Jake continued talking, mostly to himself. He talked about his ship, about the repairs they were doing, about the different types of cargo vessels he could see from where they sat. The warrior listened without saying anything. This became their routine. Jake would find Kethver during his patrols and simply sit nearby, talking about whatever came to mind. Sometimes he talked about his crew, sometimes about the places he'd been, sometimes about the weather systems on different planets. Kethver never responded, but Jake noticed he began timing his patrols to be in certain places when Jake usually showed up. Jake's crew thought he was crazy. Lisa Park, his chief engineer, pulled him aside after a week of this behavior. "Captain, what are you doing?" she asked, her face full of concern. "That thing could kill you without even trying. The stories about the Vorthak are terrifying." "He's not a thing, Lisa. He's a person. And he's been keeping this station safe for 50 years, by scaring everyone, by being here." "There's a difference," Lisa shook her head. "I've been asking around. Nobody knows much about him except that he showed up decades ago and never causes trouble." "But Captain, he's a Vorthak. Their whole species was built for war." Jake understood her concerns, but something about Kethver didn't fit the stories. Yes, he was huge and intimidating, but Jake had seen him carefully step around small aliens in the corridors. He had watched the warrior help an elderly trader pick up dropped packages. Though he did it without speaking and left immediately afterward, the breakthrough came during Jake's second week on the station. A massive storm system hit the area, something the locals called a plasma storm. The station's shields held, but the electrical interference knocked out power to several sections. Emergency lighting kicked in, but many systems went offline. Jake was in his quarters when the lights went out. He grabbed a portable light and headed for the engineering sections, thinking he might be able to help with repairs. As he made his way through the darkened corridors, he heard the sound of heavy machinery running manually. Someone was operating the backup systems by hand, following the sound. Jake found himself in the lower levels of the station, areas most people never visited. The air was hotter here, and he could hear the steady rhythm of someone working hard. When he turned a corner, his light fell on Kethver. The warrior had removed his helmet and upper armor. His skin was dark gray, almost black, and covered in old scars. Sweat ran down his face as he operated a massive manual crank that controlled the station's backup life support. His muscles strained with each turn, but he kept working steadily. Jake realized what was happening. With the power out, the automatic systems couldn't maintain air circulation for the entire station. Someone had to operate the backup manually, or people in the affected sections would start having trouble breathing. Kethver had taken on this job himself. Without thinking, Jake set down his light and moved to help. He grabbed onto the crank. "Handle next to Kethver's hands." The warrior looked at him with surprise, but didn't stop working. "Which direction?" Jake asked. Kethver nodded toward the right. Together, they turned the massive crank. Jake's strength was nothing compared to the warrior's, but every little bit helped. They worked in silence, taking turns when one of them needed to rest. For 4 hours, they kept the life support running manually. Jake's hands were raw and his back ached, but he didn't complain. Kethver worked with the steady determination of someone who had done hard labor before. When the power finally came back on and the automatic systems resumed, they both sat down on the floor, exhausted. "Your species is unexpected," Kethver said, his voice rough from breathing hard. It was the first time he had spoken to Jake since their meeting at the window. "So are you," Jake replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. Kethver looked at him with those amber eyes. "You helped without being asked. Why?" "Because you needed help. And because what you were doing was important." The warrior was quiet for a long moment. "Most beings see only what they expect to see when they look at me. What do they expect to see? A monster." Jake stood up and offered his hand to help Kethver to his feet. The warrior stared at the offered hand for several seconds before taking it. Even sitting down, he was almost as tall as Jake standing up. "I see someone who spent 4 hours making sure other people could breathe," Jake said. "That doesn't sound like a monster to me." From that night on, their relationship changed. Kethver began responding to Jake's questions during their daily meetings. He spoke slowly and carefully, as if he wasn't used to conversation, but he spoke. Jake learned that the warrior knew everything about the station's operations. He knew which merchants were honest and which ones cheated their customers. He knew which areas were safe and which ones had problems with crime. "You watch over this," Place like it's your home, Jake observed one day as they stood in the main plaza. It is my home, Kethver replied. The only home I've had for 50 years. What about before that? The warrior's expression darkened. Before that I had no home. Only battles and conquest and the songs of war. Jake wanted to ask more, but he could see that this was difficult for Kethver to talk about. Instead, he changed the subject to something lighter. Over the following days, he began to learn small things about the warrior's daily life. Kethver lived in the abandoned section of the station, in rooms that had been sealed off years ago. He had made them livable again, though Jake imagined they were probably very basic. The warrior ate simple food and seemed to need very little sleep. He spent most of his time patrolling the station, preventing problems before they could start. Do you ever get lonely? Jake asked one day. Kethver considered the question seriously. Loneliness is safer than the alternative. What alternative? Caring about others. When you care, you can lose them. When you lose them, the pain is worse than any physical wound. Jake understood that feeling. He had lost people he cared about, too. But if you never care about anyone, you're already lost. The warrior looked at him with something that might have been surprise. You speak as if you know this pain. I do. I lost my family in a pirate attack 3 years ago. Wife and daughter. For a long time I thought it would be easier to just stay alone. What changed? Jake smiled sadly. I realized that they wouldn't want me to stop living. And I realized that being alone didn't make the pain go away. It just made it harder to bear. Kethver was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Jake had ever heard it. I am sorry for your loss, Jake Morrison. I'm sorry for yours too, Kethver. Whatever you lost, whoever you lost, I'm sorry. The warrior nodded slowly. For the first time since Jake had known him, Kethver looked less like a feared monster and more like what he really was, a being who had been carrying pain alone for far too long. That night, as Jake walked back to his ship, he realized something important had changed. He and Kethver were no longer just two beings who happened to talk to each other. They were becoming friends. And friendship, Jake knew, was the first step toward healing the wounds that isolation had created. 3 weeks had passed since the power outage, and Jake's ship was finally ready to leave Nexus Prime, but he found himself making excuses to stay longer. His crew was getting restless, but Jake wasn't ready to end his friendship with Kethver. The warrior had slowly begun to open up, sharing small pieces of his thoughts and observations about life on the station. One evening, Jake found Kethver in an area he had never seen before. The warrior was sitting in what looked like an old storage room in the abandoned section of the station. The walls were covered with strange symbols carved into the metal. Each symbol was about the size of Jake's hand, and there were hundreds of them covering every surface. What is this place? Jake asked, stepping carefully into the room. Kethver looked up from where he sat on the floor. My quarters, my home. Jake studied the carved symbols more closely. They were beautiful in their own way, but they felt sad somehow. What do the symbols mean? They are names, Kethver said quietly. The names of those who died because of me? Because of my people, because of what we did to the galaxy. The weight of those words settled on Jake like a heavy blanket. He looked around the room again, counting the symbols. There were so many. You carved all of these? Over 50 years. When I remember a name, I carve it. When I remember a world we destroyed, I carve the names of its people. It is ... How do you say penance? Jake sat down on the floor across from Kethver. Tell me about your people. The real story, not the legends. Kethver was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with old pain. The Vorthak were once a peaceful species. We lived on a world of music and art. Our voices could create beauty beyond imagination. But war came to our world, brought by invaders who wanted to enslave us. What happened? We learned to fight. We learned to use our voices as weapons instead of instruments of beauty. We drove away the invaders, but the war changed us. We became what we had fought against. Kethver stood up and touched one of the symbols on the wall. We told ourselves that we were bringing order to chaos, that we were protecting the galaxy from worse threats. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. We had become addicted to conquest, to the power that came from being feared. Jake listened as Kethver continued his story. The warrior spoke of battles that lasted for years, of worlds that surrendered without fighting because they knew resistance was hopeless. He spoke of the Vorthak fleet spreading across the galaxy like a dark tide, consuming everything in its path. We called ourselves war singers, Kethver said. Our battle cries could shatter mountains. Our songs could drive enemy armies mad with terror. I was one of the best. My voice could destroy entire cities. But you stopped. Your people aren't conquering worlds anymore. What happened? Kethver's shoulders sagged. We realized what we had become, some of us anyway. There was a great debate among our people. Half wanted to continue the conquests. They said we were destined to rule the galaxy. The other half wanted to stop, to find a way to make up for what we had done. And we fought each other, a civil war that lasted decades. Brother against brother, family against family. In the end, we destroyed ourselves more completely than any enemy ever could have. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. You mean your people are all gone? As far as I know, I am the last. The war scattered us across the galaxy. Some fled to distant worlds. Others chose to end their lives rather than live with the shame of what we had done. A few, like me, decided to try to find redemption. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Jake looked at the symbols on the walls with new understanding. Each one represented not just a death, but a weight that Kethver carried every day. Is that why you came here? To find redemption? I came here to hide, Kethver said honestly. I told myself it was about redemption, but really I just wanted to disappear. I wanted to find a place where no one knew what I had been, where I could pretend the past had never happened. But you became a protector instead. I became what this place needed. When I arrived, there were pirates and criminals causing trouble. Merchants were being robbed. People were afraid to come here. I realized that I could use my reputation to help instead of harm. Jake stood up and walked to one of the walls. He studied the symbols, thinking about the incredible burden Kethver had been carrying alone. Have you ever considered that, maybe? You've already found your redemption? What do you mean? You've spent 50 years protecting people. You've stopped crimes, prevented wars, kept this station safe. How many lives have you saved? Kethver shook his head. It does not balance. It can never balance. The evil I did was too great. Maybe it's not about balance. Maybe it's about choice. Every day you choose to be better than you were. Every day you choose to protect instead of destroy. That has to count for something. Before Kethver could respond, Jake's communicator buzzed. It was Lisa Park, his chief engineer. Her voice was urgent. Captain, you need to get back to the ship immediately. We've got a problem. Jake looked at Kethver apologetically. I have to go, but this conversation isn't over. The warrior nodded. Go, your crew needs you. Jake hurried back to his ship, where he found his crew gathered around the sensor displays. Lisa's face was pale with worry. Captain, long-range sensors are picking up a massive fleet. They're heading straight for Nexus Prime. Jake studied the readings. The fleet was huge, made up of warships from several different species. Who are they? The Hegemony, said Pete Collins, his communications officer. They're that alliance of species that's been expanding aggressively through the Outer Rim. They've been demanding tribute from trading stations and destroying anyone who refuses to pay. How long until they get here? 2 days, maybe 3 if we're lucky. Jake felt his stomach drop. The Hegemony was known for their ruthless tactics. They would demand that Nexus Prime join their alliance and pay massive tribute. If the station refused, they would destroy it and everyone on it. What about the station's defenses? Lisa checked her readings. They've got a small defense fleet, but it's nothing compared to what's coming. Maybe a dozen ships total, and most of them are converted cargo vessels. Jake thought about all the people on the station. The merchants, the families, the workers who had made this place their home. He thought about Veltar, the nervous restaurant owner who had been kind to him. He thought about the elderly trader Kethver had helped, and all the other beings who lived their quiet lives in the safety the station provided. And he thought about Kethver, sitting alone in his room full of carved names, carrying the weight of his people's sins. "Captain," Pete said quietly, "we should leave. Our ship isn't built for fighting, and we can't do anything to help against a fleet that size." Jake knew Pete was right. The smart thing would be to leave immediately before the hegemony arrived. But as he looked at his crew, he realized he couldn't do it. He couldn't abandon the people who had become part of his life over the past few weeks. "Start preparing the ship for departure," he said finally. "But we're not leaving yet. First, I need to talk to someone." As his crew began their preparations, Jake walked back toward the abandoned section of the station. He had a feeling that Kethver was going to face the hardest choice of his life, and Jake wanted to be there when it happened. The warrior who had spent 50 years trying to forget his past was about to discover whether redemption was really possible, or whether some sins were too great to ever be forgiven. Jake found Kethver standing in the main observation deck, watching the stars through the massive windows. The warrior's posture was different now. His shoulders were straight, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked like a soldier preparing for battle. "You heard about the hegemony fleet," Jake said, walking up beside him. "Word travels fast on a station this size. The panic is already beginning." Jake could see what Kethver meant. Through the windows he watched as ships began leaving the docking bays. Some were traders cutting their visits short. Others were families who lived on the station but had somewhere else to go. The smart ones were getting out while they still could. "The station administrator asked me to speak with you," Jake said. "Carefully. He wants to know if you'll help defend the station." Kethver's amber eyes never left the stars. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I would ask. But the choice is yours." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Jake could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air between them. Finally, Kethver turned to face him. "I swore an oath 50 years ago, Jake Morrison. I swore never to sing the songs of war again. Never to use my voice as a weapon. Never to become what I once was. This isn't about conquest. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves." "Is it? Or is it about giving me an excuse to return to the violence I once loved?" Jake studied his friend's face. He could see the fear there, not fear of the enemy, but fear of himself. "Do you think you would enjoy it? The fighting?" Kethver closed his eyes. "That is what terrifies me most. Part of me, part of me misses it. The power. The feeling of being unstoppable. When I see injustice, when I watch bullies arm the innocent, there is a voice in my head that whispers about how easy it would be to simply destroy them. But you don't listen to that voice." "No, but in battle, with my blood running hot and my voice raised in the war song, I might not be able to control it. I might become the monster I once was?" Jake understood now. It wasn't that Kethver couldn't help defend the station. It was that he was afraid of what he might become if he did. "What if you weren't alone?" Jake asked. "What if someone was there to remind you who you are now?" Kethver looked at him with surprise. "You would stay, your ship could leave, you could be safe. Some things are more important than safety." Before Kethver could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the station. The emergency lighting switched on, bathing everything in red. Jake's communicator buzzed with an urgent message from Lisa. "Captain, the hegemony fleet just dropped out of hyperspace. They're 12 hours ahead of schedule." Jake and Kethver rushed to the command center, where Veltar was coordinating the station's defenses. The small Quillen was shaking as he gave orders to the few warships that remained. "How many ships do we have?" Jake asked. 8 fighters and 2 patrol vessels, Veltar replied, his voice high with stress. "The hegemony brought 47 warships. We can't fight them." On the main screen, Jake could see the enemy fleet approaching. They were massive ships, built for war and intimidation. Each one was larger than the entire station's defense force combined. Have they made contact? Kethver asked. Yes, they're demanding we surrender and join their alliance. They want tribute payments and the right to use this station as a military base. If we refuse, they'll destroy us. Jake felt anger building in his chest. The hegemony was nothing but a group of bullies using their strength to take what they wanted from weaker beings. It was exactly the kind of evil that someone like Kethver could stop. How long do we have? He asked. They're giving us 2 hours to decide. After that, they attack. The command center fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the distant sound of people packing their belongings. Jake looked at Kethver, who was staring at the approaching fleet with an unreadable expression. There are 30,000 people on this station, Jake said quietly. Families, children, elderly beings who have nowhere else to go. The hegemony won't just destroy the station. They'll kill everyone who can't escape in time. Kethver's hands clenched into fists. No, you're the only one who can stop them. I know that too. Jake made a decision that would change everything. Then I'm staying with you. Whatever happens, whatever you become, I'll be there to remind you who you really are. Kethver turned to look at him, his amber eyes wide with surprise. You would risk your life for people you barely know? I would risk my life for a friend who's trying to do the right thing. For a moment, Jake thought he saw tears in the warrior's eyes. Then Kethver straightened up, and his expression became determined. Veltar, evacuate as many people as you can. Get the ships that can't fight to take civilians to safety. Tell the defense fleet to stay back unless I call for them. You're going to help us? Veltar asked, his voice filled with hope. I'm going to try. Jake followed Kethver as he left the command center and headed toward the abandoned section of the station. The warrior moved with purpose now, his long strides eating up the distance. When they reached his quarters, Kethver went to a corner where Jake hadn't looked before. Hidden behind a panel was a set of armor unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It was older than the black armor Kethver usually wore, made of some kind of metal that seemed to absorb light. Symbols were carved into every surface, and Jake could feel power radiating from it even though it wasn't being worn. Warsinger armor, Kethver explained. I swore I would never wear it again, but you kept it. I kept it to remind myself of what I had been, and perhaps because I knew this day would come. Kethver began removing his regular armor, revealing the scarred gray skin beneath. The old wounds told the story of countless battles, each one a reminder of the violence he had once lived for. Jake, Kethver said as he began putting on the ancient armor, if I lose myself in the battle, if I become the monster I once was, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me you'll find a way to stop me. Even if it means killing me. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Kethver, I can't promise that. You must. The war song is not just a weapon, it's a madness that consumes everything. If I fall to it, I will become worse than the hegemony. I will become the destroyer of worlds again. Jake watched as his friend sealed the ancient armor around his massive frame. The transformation was incredible. Kethver seemed to grow even larger, more imposing. Power radiated from him like heat from a fire. I won't let that happen, Jake said firmly. I'll keep you anchored to who you are now. I'll remind you of the names on your walls, of the people you've saved, of the choice you're making right now. Kethver nodded slowly. Then let us go. It is time for the last war singer of the Vorthak to sing once more. As they walked toward the docking bay where Kethver's fighter waited, Jake could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. In a few hours, they would face an enemy that had never known defeat. They would fight against impossible odds to protect people who had spent 50 years, fearing the very being who was now their only hope. But as Jake looked at his friend, he realized something important. Kethver wasn't just a warrior anymore. He was someone who had chosen to be better than his past. And that choice, Jake believed, would make all the difference in the battle to come. The galaxy was about to witness something it had never seen before, a war singer fighting not for conquest, but for love. Kethver's fighter ship was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It was sleek and black, built for speed and war. Strange symbols covered its hull, and Jake could feel power humming through its metal frame. The cockpit was designed for someone much larger than a human, but Kethver had made modifications so Jake could sit in a smaller seat beside him. "Stay close to me during the battle," Kethver said as they launched from the station. The war song affects everyone nearby. You may feel confused or frightened, but do not let it overwhelm you. Jake strapped himself in and watched as they flew toward the hegemony fleet. The enemy ships were massive, their hulls covered in weapons and armor. They moved in perfect formation like a pack of predators closing in on their prey. "Attention, Nexus Prime," a voice crackled over the communication system. "This is Admiral Voss of the Hegemony Fleet. You have 1 hour to surrender or we will destroy your station and everyone on it." Jake could see the fear in Veltar's voice when he responded, "Please, Admiral. We are just a trading station. We have no military value." "Why do you want to destroy us?" "Because you exist without our permission," Admiral Voss replied coldly. "Because you trade freely without paying tribute to us. Because you represent everything we are working to eliminate from this galaxy." The communication ended, leaving only silence and the steady hum of the fighter's engines. Jake looked at Kethver, who was staring at the enemy fleet with intense concentration. "There are too many of them," Jake said. "Even with your abilities, how can we fight 47 ships?" "The war song is not just a weapon," Kethver explained. "It is a force that can inspire or terrify, create or destroy. In the old days, a single war singer could turn the tide of any battle, but I have not sung the full song in 50 years. I do not know if I still can." As they approached the enemy fleet, Jake could see smaller ships launching from the hegemony vessels. Fighters and bombers, dozens of them, moving toward Nexus Prime like a swarm of angry insects. "They're not waiting for the deadline," Jake realized. "They're attacking now." Kethver's hands tightened on the controls. Admiral Voss is known for his cruelty. He enjoys watching others suffer. The deadline was just a way to make the people on the station more afraid. The first wave of enemy fighters reached the station's defense fleet. Jake watched in horror as the small patrol vessels were quickly overwhelmed. Explosions lit up the space around Nexus Prime as the defenders fought desperately against impossible odds. "We have to help them," Jake said. "No," Kethver replied, his voice steady. "If I begin the war song now, while I am still thinking clearly, I may be able to control it. But once it starts, there is no stopping until the battle is over." Jake understood. This wasn't just about fighting. It was about Kethver's struggle with his own nature, his fear of becoming the monster he once was. "Then let's end this quickly." Jake said, "I'm ready." Kethver looked at him one last time. "Remember, Jake Morrison, if I lose myself, if I become something evil, you must find a way to stop me." "I won't let that happen," Jake promised. "I'll keep you anchored to who you are now." Kethver nodded and activated the ship's external speakers. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was different. Deeper, more powerful, filled with ancient authority. "I am Kethver, last of the war singers. I am the guardian of this station and protector of its people. Leave now or face the consequences." Admiral Voss's laughter echoed across the communication channels. "A single Vorthic warrior thinks he can defeat our entire fleet? You are either very brave or very stupid." "I am neither," Kethver replied. "I am simply someone who has chosen to stand between you and the innocent." And then he began to sing. The war song started as a low rumble in Kethver's chest, but it quickly grew in power and complexity. Jake felt it in his bones, in his blood, in the very air around him. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, a sound that spoke of ancient battles and forgotten heroes. The song reached out across space, touching every ship in the area. Jake could see the effects immediately. The enemy fighters began to waver in their formation, their pilots struggling to maintain control as fear crept into their hearts. But the song affected more than just the enemy. Jake felt his own courage growing, his determination becoming stronger. He understood now why the Vorthek had been so feared. The war song didn't just terrify enemies, it inspired allies, giving them strength beyond their normal limits, the remaining ships of the stations. Defense fleets suddenly fought with renewed vigor. Their weapons seemed more accurate, their movements more coordinated. What had been a desperate retreat became a fighting withdrawal. Kethver's fighter moved through the enemy formation like a force of nature. His weapons destroyed everything. They touched, and his song grew louder and more powerful with each victory. Jake watched in amazement as enemy pilots abandoned their ships rather than face the approaching war singer. But as the battle continued, Jake began to notice changes. In his friend, Kethver's eyes were glowing brighter, and his expression was becoming more savage. The careful control he had maintained was starting to slip. "Kethver," Jake said, speaking directly into the warrior's ear, "remember who you are. Remember the names on your walls. Remember the people you've saved." The warrior's head turned toward him, and for a moment Jake saw something terrifying in those amber eyes. The bloodlust of ancient battles, the joy of destruction that had once defined the Vorthek people. "I remember," Kethver said, but his voice was different now, harder, more dangerous. "I remember the glory of conquest. I remember the fear in our enemies' eyes when they heard our songs." Jake felt a chill of fear. This was exactly what Kethver had been afraid of. The war song was awakening the monster he had spent 50 years trying to forget. "No," Jake said firmly. "That's not who you are anymore. You're Kethver, guardian of Nexus Prime. You're the being who spent 4 hours turning a crank to keep people breathing. You're my friend." The warrior's expression wavered, confusion mixing with the ancient rage. The song faltered for a moment, and Jake could see the enemy fleet beginning to regroup. "They're getting away," Kethver growled. "We must pursue them. We must destroy them all." "No," Jake said again. "We must protect the station. That's why we're here." Jake reached out and placed his hand on Kethver's armored shoulder. The metal was hot to the touch, radiating the power of the war song. "Look. At the station, Kethver, look at the people we're protecting." Through the cockpit window they could see Nexus Prime. The enemy fighters were retreating, their formation broken by the power of the war song. The station's lights were still shining, its people still safe. "We've won," Jake said softly. "The battle is over. You can stop now." Kethver's song began to fade, the ancient power slowly ebbing away. His eyes returned to their normal amber glow, and the savage expression left his face. When he looked at Jake, he was himself again. "I almost lost control," he said, his voice shaking. "I almost became what I once was, but you didn't," Jake replied. "You chose to be better. You chose to protect instead of destroy." Admiral Voss's voice crackled over the communication system. "One last time. This isn't over, Warsinger. The hegemony will return." "If you do," Kethver responded, his voice calm and steady, "you will find me waiting, and next time I will not be alone." As the enemy fleet retreated into hyperspace, Jake looked at his friend with new respect. Kethver had faced his greatest fear and emerged victorious. Not because he had conquered his enemies, but because he had conquered himself. "What happens now?" Jake asked. Kethver smiled, and for the first time since Jake had known him, it was a smile without sadness. "Now we go home. The people of Nexus Prime will be waiting to thank their guardian." As they flew back toward the station, Jake realized that something fundamental had changed. Kethver was no longer the feared monster hiding in the shadows. He was a protector, a guardian, a friend. And the galaxy was a better place because of it. The last war singer of the Vorthak had found his redemption at last.